Well, good morning, guys.
Good morning.
And here we are. That's a hearty good morning for such a kind of a gray morning. Is it gray out, or is the sun not up yet? I'm not sure. Starting to get, days are starting to get longer though.
Nice next couple of days. Weather comes in the weekend.
Yeah. Bill, you're going to be gone next week?
Yeah.
To the you said the Bahamas on a mission trip?
Sure.
Well, we wish you well. That'd be good.
Nick's not here. Nick is hooked. No. Nick's got 3 6 weeks off. We'll call him.
Well, let's continue our look this morning at the life of Jacob, and this is the introductory slide we use every week. We're getting right down to the bottom here, and we're just about finished. Last week, review, we looked at chapter 50, verses 1 through 3, and what we looked at is, of course, the occasion of this text is Jacob dies, and Joseph, his son, we really were given the privilege to look at this really unleashed grief as at that moment of death when Jacob passes, and we analyzed it just briefly last week. We see two basic categories of actions where Joseph engaged in the grief, he fell, he wept, he kissed, and he continued for the 40 appointed days. And then the second piece of it, almost in a juxtaposition to the first, is he takes command. He commands that the necessary and cultural acceptable practices of burial are begun, and that was the lad he commanded. So I put this in a really simplistic drawing, that there's two major factors going on in Joseph's life here. There is the loss or the trauma, rather, caused by loss, the trauma of the loss. And then secondly, the letting go and moving on in life. And those two, through the grieving process, those two opposite forces are at work. And I put a very simplistic line in the middle. As time goes on, there should be a natural a letting go that occurs for us to be released and to move on in life, but not to the expense of allowing ourselves to go through the necessary grieving that occurs at a time like this. So that's what we talked about last week. Now let's somebody could you mark your place there and read for us verses 4 through 11, because that's what we'll be looking at today. Chapter 50, verses 4 through 11.
And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, and say, My father made me swear, saying, Though I die, in my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray you, and bury my father, and I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father, according to as he made you swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. And all the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house, only their little ones and their flocks and their herds did they leave in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel-Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan.
Good. Thank you, David. Now, I'm assuming you're reading that out of the King James?
Yeah.
All right, thank
The
you.
authorized version.
Yeah. That's just fine. Well, as we look at this text, verses 4 through 11, I see it naturally, the flow of it is in two pieces, divided by a paragraph, or in two separate paragraphs, rather. First of all, is Joseph's request to Pharaoh. Did you notice anything interesting about this request?
If I found favor in your sight. I mean, he's been second in command for.
Yeah, and he goes indirectly. I just thought that was really odd that he went through were they the proper channels? I don't know if I found favor.
He still carries great respect for the man.
Yeah. And of course, the answer is, of course, you can go bury your father. I mean, that's how I read the text anyway. So he makes this request, verses 4 through 6, and then he's granted permission, and it is quite an entourage that then travels back to the land of Canaan. But they don't go into the southern route. They don't come up on the west side of Jordan. They actually go around, and they're across the Jordan River, which would be in today what would be called Jordan, I guess, would be there, or down in what would be called Edom in biblical times, southern Jordan. I'm picturing it just east of the Dead Sea, because they move across, and they're eventually going to be headed to Hebron, and for the burial. So I'm just kind of putting that together in my head. But the second piece is the travel to and the mourning at Abel Matzarim, which means the mourning of the Egyptians. Matzarim means Egypt. Excuse me, Mitzrayim. Abel Mitzrayim. So the thing that I thought about, where my head was this week, was this idea of full stop. And I learned this week that the punctuation mark, what we call a period, is in England, in British literature, called a full stop. They call a period, punctuation mark period, full stop. So I really clinged on to that term, and that we're going to carry that term out, a full stop. A full stop. Full stop is the British English term for this punctuation mark. It is known as a period in American English, and I cited the reference. And so I see this text this way in this drawing. We are moving through life. We are represented by the arrow, and we've got our inertia, we've got our movement, we've got our plans, we have everything in place. We want to create higher sense of order and movement, and then all of a sudden this period happens in our life. We are drawn to a full stop. And that is the context of what occurs often when a death occurs, when a sense of loss, when a loss occurs in our lives, it is a period that is induced, a full stop, and all of a sudden we find ourselves at this period, this stop, like a barrier, and there is energy, and there are things that take place at that moment, and that's where I'd like to talk about today, this idea of full stop. And so I derived what I think are three characteristics of an instance like this, a full stop. Number one, full stops, or think of the punctuation mark periods. When we reach an ending, a period, full stops oftentimes occur as a surprise. Not always, but we are moving through life, and all of a sudden we have a tragic loss of either a person, a loved one, or a job, or a relationship, or a financial situation. There is a loss, and it is coming out of left field. It's a surprise. And so because of that, number two, hey Carl, I think that resistance within us, there's a welling up inside of us of resistance, and resistance is the natural response to a full stop. we have our life, we have our course of action, our direction, and then all of a sudden this thing happens and the brakes are put on, and just in the physical sense, the physics of that energy has to go somewhere. We are not accustomed to the idea of coming to a barrier like this in a full stop. And the natural tendency in us that I'm suggesting is that we want to keep going. It is difficult for us to come to full stop. I think of times when I become ill, the flu. Dick had the flu. And my history has been, when this occurs, I try to keep working. Oh, I'm okay. I'll just keep working. And there have been times when I've been sitting at my desk for maybe up to an hour just trying to get going, just trying to do something. Do you know what I'm talking about? Because I'm really not sick. But yet everything around me say, you have no energy for anything. Just drop what you're doing and go back to bed. You know what I'm talking about?
That's denial. That's the first step.
Yes, it's denial. It's trying to push through. I would imagine Dave Brown and Bob would have loads of stories as they see grieving people coming in to plan services, and the idea that not absorb, not embracing what has happened, but let's just go through this and so we can get on with our lives. You're nodding. Yep.
My wife loved that series of This Is Us. She really got caught up in it. We watched
The what?
This Is Us, that TV series that followed the Super Bowl. And there's a scene in there where her husband died, and they did such a nice job portraying her. Just wanted everybody to give her a whole bunch of space because she wasn't ready to embrace it for a few minutes. I mean, she heard the words, but she just had to get in, get out of here. I got to sit down and get ready to accept this.
Right. Yeah. I think we need to understand this about ourselves and about others. If we're entering into the grief of someone else, to give them a sense of space. But boy, I don't know. How do you handle a situation like that? Do you try to coach them, or do you just let it go?
Well, both philosophically and ethically, it's a fine line, because my mission or my philosophy is to serve, not to sell.
Yeah.
So I have to be careful that I'm not steering or coercing people into doing things that they feel they don't want to do, but that's juxtaposed against the situation that we're talking about, where many people are in a situation and they've made up their minds for whatever reason to not do anything. And that's not good for them at all.
Right.
So it's that balance between encouraging them, giving them the space they need, making sure that they understand that they don't have to do everything, make all these decisions right now. I think generally what it often boils down to is when that period happens, when that full stop occurs, suddenly they're face to face with not only sociological or cultural implications of what's going on, but they may also be faced with a spiritual confrontation in a sense, because now any kind of saying the right thing to be accepted and being in the right flow and everything, now it's not saying things, now it's the real thing. This person is dead. Do I really believe what I've been saying all these years?
Yeah.
So it's a heavy time.
Yeah, really heavy time. Yeah. It just, all of a sudden, my world changes. And, let me back up for a minute. Joseph is an example of someone who is really embracing what has occurred. And we're watching him go through this and actually leading his family through this grieving process at the time. But backing from that, I think our human tendency is to not stop and to somehow dismiss it. Number 3 here says full stops are also opportunities to gain perspective. But we have to stop in order to gain that perspective. The natural tendency, notice I've kind of embellished the picture a little bit. The 3 arrows saying, one response is, I'm just going to bull my way through. I'm just going to kind of I got to get over here. My life's got to go on. I got to get over here, so I'm just going to bull my way through this period and this barrier. I'm going to smash through and get you over here as quickly as I can. Another alternative would be to go around it, to circumvent it. And that would be more of pushing it aside over here and let others take care of it. And I've got other things I'm doing over here. And so I'll show up. And, I thought of a story. And, take this for what it's worth. But I think it's funny. And it would only be appropriate in a male audience like this, and I'm thinking of shutting off the record, but I'll go ahead and say this. But so what reminded me of this story is the Super Bowl. And do you guys see the Super Bowl? Yeah. It was a good game, it really was. But so there's this couple that had purchased. They're really football fans, and they had purchased tickets for every Super Bowl dating back to the first one, 1967, who played in the first Super Bowl?
Packers. Kansas City.
Yeah, Packers in Kansas City. And the Packers won 35-10, 1967. I know that because I looked it up. And I was a Packers fan. We were talking about this the other night. We went to a Super Bowl get-together, and we were talking about the first. Can you remember the first one? So this couple is... they've attended every Super Bowl. They get tickets and do it. And so, it just so happened now another story is this one fellow wanted to go see his Philadelphia Eagles win their very first Super Bowl. And so he connived around and finally found one ticket left, clear up, way up high into the nosebleed section. And he made it to the first Super Bowl. This was, of course, last Sunday. And so he's watching the game through his binoculars, and the guys look like ants down on the field. And and kind of in between times, he's scouring the opposite, where the crowds are, and he notices that, God, right on the 50-yard line, about 3 rows back, there's an open seat. There's an open seat at the Super Bowl. And so, he's watched the game and then he'd scan back, and that seat was open clear up until halftime. And he just thought, I've got to go see if I can get down. And so, a lot of commotion at halftime with all the fanfare and all that. And he makes his way down, and he signals the guy, and he goes like that. He goes, yeah, the guy next to the seat said, yeah, come on in, sit down. And here he is. And the second half is starting, and he's 3 rows back, right behind his Philadelphia Eagles, and he's watching the game, and he's just saying, this is absolutely fantastic, and he's beside himself, and so he starts to talk to the guy next to him. He says, and the guy explains. He says, well, my wife and I purchased tickets at this location, and we've been to every Super Bowl, but unfortunately my wife has passed away, and we had made plans to come, and I know that she would want me to be here, and so that's why. And he goes, I'm so sorry you lost your wife, and what a remarkable story that you were able to share, but I'm so sorry for your loss. And couldn't you have found a loved one or a family member to join you to today's game? And he goes, oh, well, I tried, but they're all at the funeral. You guys guys knew that was coming, didn't you? So we've got about 10 minutes, and I'd like to move to table time. And around your tables this morning, the topic is this idea of full stop. And think of a time in your life where you were forced to a full stop. And how did you respond at that time? We've looked at just briefly at Joseph's example. We've talked about human nature. We've got a diagram there. How did you respond, and what did you learn, if anything, from that experience of a full stop? So let's go ahead and just gather around, and then I'll get us together towards the end and we'll share everything. So,